The story of David, and everything we've heard about him up till now is what an amazing guy he was. And he serves as an example for so many things. One of them is that he teaches us that even the poorest and the weakest and the most marginal society can feature greatly in God's kingdom. So here was this shepherd wandering on the hills, still a teenager, and Samuel came to anoint one of the sons of Jesse. It wasn't one of the big guns, it was this shepherd on the hills who he anointed as king. It took him a while to get there, and we learned that at every stage of his journey, God was with him. Richard Rohr wrote a book called From Wild Man to Wise Man. And in it, I suppose predominantly a book for men, but we'll draw the woman into it as well. He points out that men move in stages, and they start off rather wild and woolly, not really knowing where they're going or how to get there, disintegrated, if you like. But then as they take on the challenges of life around them, he says they become warriors. So from wild man to warrior, they have to fight for their place in the world, for their identity, to discover who they really are and what God's purpose is in their lives. In the process, they become lovers, and they may acquire family. If they don't get married, they still build friendships. They learn to love. And in the process, they begin to learn how to adjust to the desires and needs of other people, and they learn compassion. David himself finally becomes a king, and in a sense we all become kings or queens of our own domain. We've studied, we've swatted, we've worked, we've been an apprentice, we've been a warrior, we've fought to get there. We are the king of our domain, whether that means we're a mother or a father or the head of a church or a doctor in a doctor's rooms. Whatever we do, in a sense, we become a king or a queen, as David has done. But you notice that in the story of David, there are no blemishes. Everything seems to be wonderful. But we know that life is not like that, really, is it? And today, we discover that this amazing guy has got clay feet. He's probably getting bored now. He's already got a whole harem of women and concubines and many wives, at least 6, and lots of children, about 20. And how can you possibly look after 20 children properly? You can't. It's impossible. Or so many, so large a family. You start to think that you're the bee's knees. You can control things. He sees this beautiful woman. Notice the verbs that are used. He sends someone to fetch her. He sends for her to come to me. And then when he discovers that she's pregnant, oh dear, who made her pregnant? Not Uriah, because he's out fighting in a battle. So he sends for Joab, the general. He sends for Uriah first to come and pretend that he's the one who fathered the child. But because of his integrity, he won't. He goes back. He sends a message to Jeroboam, is it? Jeroboam is the general. make sure this guy gets killed. So from adulterer to murderer, suddenly this unblemished record is shattered. In another book called Falling Upward, Richard Rohr says that in fact our lives are two halves. And the first half, all these things that I mentioned earlier, being a warrior, being a lover, being a king, are things that come naturally. We need to be those things. We need to strive and work for and achieve the things that God has sent us to achieve. But in the second half of our life, it's downhill. Hey? We know it's downhill all the way to the grave. But in a spiritual and a psychological sense, that is true also. Because we can't just keep riding on this ride of glory and look how wonderful I am, because life's not like that. In the second half of life, we have to learn our shortcomings, our weaknesses. We have to reflect and discover who we really are. And in the process, we learn to get rid of our pride. We learn to be more humble. And we realize that in other people too, they are facing the same challenges. And so we learn compassion. And this, in fact, is what happens to David too. But it's been forced upon him. Because now that he's committed these terrible sins, fortunately, he had a local priest, a prophet, Nathaniel. Bishop Brian's going to be preaching about it next week, so I won't make too big a deal of it. But basically, he came and told him his story, about a little lamb that a poor man loved. And the Lord of the manor came one day, had guests, and he said, I want your lamb. And the poor man was shattered because this lamb was like a child to him. And he murdered the lamb and fed the guest. And David, when he was told the story, said, how dare that guy do that? I'm going to arrest him. And Nathan said, you're that man. You're the one who killed the beloved lamb of another man. And suddenly he is shattered and broken. All those years of success, he realizes suddenly that he needs a whole lot to learn still, as indeed each one of us has to learn. And that learning comes to us in a variety of ways. It may come in a sudden divorce that was unexpected. It may come in the sudden death of a child. It may come in the loss of a job. It may come in a severe illness that permanently disfigures you or renders you helpless in some way or another. We're all forced ultimately to acknowledge that we are weak, really, at heart. But fortunate are the people who learn these things early in life. Now, the story I've been telling you has all been about a man and men, because I think that's the way men operate. But I went in a Tasky when our secretary, and I said, do women have midlife crises like David had? And she said, no. And I went and asked my family of girls, do women have a midlife crisis? They said, no, it's only men who do these silly things. I know someone came to me once and said, I spent all the early years of our marriage, 20 or 30 of them. We've been married 37 years now, 38, something like that, following you around from church to church, raising our children, cooking, cleaning, doing all sorts of servant work. It's now my time to go out and work and earn, have a job, buy a car. And I look at a lot of the parishioners in this congregation. The women in this day, fortunately, are given the opportunity in a way that they weren't in the past to do those sorts of things. We've got a plastic surgeon who sits at the back, Marissa, at the earlier service. We've got Lee, who's a clinical psychologist, and we've got Jessica, who's got a master's degree in sociology. And I know there are many of you here, and there is a sense in which that model is turned on its head. Hey, you've actually lived the second half of your life and the first half, and now living the first half and the second half of your life. But in whichever way we do it, we realize that we are dependent on God, ultimately, at the end of the day. So David faced terrible sufferings in his last 20 years. His family, because he'd been so unconcerned about them, was severely dysfunctional. For example, Absalom, his beloved oldest son, killed another of his sons because he, the other son, had raped one of his daughters. which was a heinous crime, but it wasn't something you could just go and kill someone for. He was exiled and then eventually allowed back. But when he came back, David didn't talk to him. He pretended he wasn't there. Can you imagine what that did to him? Any psychologist would tell you that that would be destructive. And it was ultimately, because then Absalom decided he was going to become king. He parked his sports car at the gate, and as people came with problems to David the king, he would grab them and say, no, come to me. I'm his son. I'll sort it out for you. And he gradually built up a clientele of people who followed him and thought he was amazing. They made him king. So he went through a really tough time. And yet in the midst of that, having learned his failures and acknowledging the sin of adultery and murder with Bathsheba and Uriah, he finally was able to confront who he really was. And he repented. And he became a Christ follower or a God follower more than ever. And he wrote some of the most beautiful poetry, some of the most wonderful psalms that teach us about these struggles that we have in the second half of our life. He deepened his faith. And so in one sense, it's a kind of a downhill road all the way. And yet for him, he finally found his center. And I think Jesus is the one who is being pointed to in the life of David ultimately. Because he truly is the sinless one. He was a warrior. He fought for justice and truth. He was a lover. Every marginalized person, woman, diseased, broken person, he loved. He was a king, but not the kind of king that we think of, because they gave him a crown of thorns to crown him as he lay dying for us on the cross. His whole life, in one sense, was the second half of life, pouring out himself for others. And so I believe as we go today, what we're being taught is that just as David had to discover his purpose was more than just living for himself, so we too know that, need to be reminded of that, and need to live it out in the way in which we love and serve other people for Christ. In a Christ-like way. So I want you just to be still for a moment and think about the ways in which you this week will be able to serve and love others at your expense, rather than simply thinking that you are the center of the universe. And so, Lord, give us the strength and courage to spend our lives serving others. Help us to be the light in people's darkness, the love in people's loneliness, the joy in people's sorrow as we share our lives with them. Amen. Now we're going to have that time of repentance. We can put that up. It comes after the sermon in the slideshow. I'll need to get my service quickly.